We Jews live with the times. That means we don't live with Obama, we live with the reading of the Torah. And this week's Torah reading talks about Moses' error. Moses is told by God, when the people demand water after having gone through the entire generation without lacking food or water in a desert, the one day that the water stops and they demand water, Moses was mourning over his sister Miriam. You see, it was in her merit that water came. And now that Miriam was gone, they needed a new merit, a new prayer, a new source for the water. And God is told, don't worry, go talk to the rock. The same rock that gave the water while Miriam was alive will give the water now. And Moses was told to go with a staff, which is a sign of royalty, and to go with the heads of the community to speak to the rock. And Moses didn't know which rock to speak to. And the people got edgy and was telling him, what difference does it make? Just tell the rock to give water. And Moses, it says, got angry with them. And he said, God has designated a rock. You have to speak to that rock. And in his frustration, took a stick, and instead of hitting at the people, hit at a rock. Turned out to be the rock of Miriam, and it gushed forth its waters. Such is the story in the Agadic interpretation of the saga of Moses. And Moses was told by God, because you failed to give the people faith, because if you had spoken, as I said, they would have realized that they didn't need to be beaten or browbeaten or threatened, just as the rock can be told to do what is God's bidding, so too man should do the same. Man doesn't need somebody over him with a sword or a gun to force him to follow the Torah. But by hitting the rock, you missed making that point. And therefore, you will not enter the land of Israel. And that's the simple interpretation as to why Moses dies in the desert with his desire unfulfilled. According to Maimonides, the sin of Moses was really much more subtle. It had nothing to do with hitting the rock or talking to the rock. This could be understood. Why Moses in his frustration would lash out at the rock instead of to a person. Rather, it was the fact that Moses got angry. And what's wrong with Moses getting angry? You see, the people were men of great knowledge and understood that Moses' actions reflected the will of God. And they thought that if Moses was getting angry, that was reflecting God's feelings. And they got the impression that any time they needed something, God would get angry. Why should they even question? They should just accept what God gives them. They need not pray, for God has them in mind. And this is also a wrong attitude. According to this, a person should never pray for his needs. According to this, a person should not pursue his needs, because it's all in the hands of God. So Moses taught them the wrong lesson by virtue of the fact that he got angry and hit the rock. And in teaching them the wrong lesson, this was a permanent problem. It became a lesson that they had learned badly. And therefore, he no longer could teach them the proper way. It had to be someone else. Both of these approach this that Moses did something wrong. And because he did something wrong, he had to be removed as the leader. Because if you don't punish those who sin, or those who have some faults, if you don't go ahead and correct it, then people will think that God takes bribes. Here is Moses doing something wrong, and God's letting him get away with it. Therefore, God couldn't let him get away with it, and he could not go across the Jordan. Both of these approaches look at Moses as if Moses was incomplete in some way, and that we had to be shown the lesson that God would punish even the greatest of men. I have a bias. I believe Moses was a perfect man. And I don't believe Moses sinned. What can you do? I got this bias. And therefore, in my opinion, it isn't a punishment. Rather, it's a consequence of the persona of Moses. You see, there are different types of teachers. I'm talking to you by virtue of this video machine. I know how to speak English. I know some of the slang that's come across my 63 years. I know the things that interest people because I've got interests that are similar. If you had a person who spoke with a broken English and didn't understand what the Yankees are, he couldn't relate. Each generation needs a leader that relates to that generation. And Moses was just too far above that new generation to be an effective leader. It had nothing to do with the sin of Moses. Moses had no sin. Moses was perfect. He just was not the leader for that generation. He couldn't relate to a bunch of little kids who had gotten spoiled by the fact that God had coddled them for 40 years in the desert. They were given all of their needs, and they expected what they needed whenever they needed it without any problems. And Moses just couldn't understand how they could be so unappreciative. He couldn't understand how they could be so demanding and so frustrating. He couldn't understand that these people lacked the basic elements of faith to pray on their own. No, Moses had to provide them with what's going on. What are you guys doing? Haven't you seen that this is a process of the community, that God wants the whole community to pray to God? Haven't you learned that? Haven't you learned the fact that God takes care of you? You don't have to go ahead and get all bent out of shape the minute something bad takes place. Moses was frustrated with the new generation. And the new generation couldn't understand Moses. They thought he was just an old man out of touch. Like the Democrats who voted Democrat this election, because the Republicans were out of touch. They didn't know the problems that we had. That's the way they thought. And so Moses had to be removed because he was out of touch. Because every generation needs the leadership that's fit for that generation. The wrong kind of leadership bring the wrong kind of results. Had Moses stayed on, it wouldn't have worked. And that's why the story of the rock caused Moses to leave, not because he sinned, but because that was the end of his generation.